Not every story on this channel is about someone quietly getting it right. Some of the most useful ones are about someone smart, careful, and well-intentioned getting it wrong in a way almost nobody around them was equipped to catch, which is exactly what happened here. Everyone in his life told him it was a smart move. His parents were relieved. His girlfriend at the time seemed genuinely proud of him. Even his accountant, when he mentioned it in passing, nodded along and said something about how appearances matter more than people like to admit in his line of work. The decision was to lease a car that cost $40,000 more over the life of the lease than the reliable used sedan he'd been driving for 3 years. Everyone was right that it looked smart. Nobody in his life, including him, ran the actual number until it was far too late to matter. His name is Marcus, no relation to the Marcus from another story I've told, and he agreed to walk me through exactly how that decision happened, step by step, because he thinks the reasoning that led him there is far more common and far more dangerous than any single bad financial choice could ever be on its own. Marcus was 29 when he got promoted into a client-facing role at a mid-sized consulting firm, the kind of job where you're expected to sit across a table from executives and be taken seriously within about 4 seconds of walking into the room. His new manager, without ever saying it explicitly, made it clear during onboarding that how you present mattered for this particular role in a way it hadn't for his old one. Marcus, reasonably, interpreted this as permission, maybe even instruction to upgrade how he showed up. And the used sedan he'd been quietly proud of 3 months earlier suddenly felt in his own head like evidence against him. This is the part Marcus wants people to understand clearly, because he thinks it's where the actual mistake happened, well before he ever set foot in a dealership. Nobody told him directly to lease a luxury car. He built that requirement himself, out of a vague social cue and his own anxiety about being taken seriously, and then treated the requirement he'd invented as though it had come from somewhere official and non-negotiable. He test drove 3 cars over 2 weekends and settled on a lease that ran $710 a month. Compared to the roughly $90 a month, his old sedan had been costing him in maintenance and depreciation combined. The dealer, a genuinely friendly guy named Ted, who Marcus still speaks well of, framed the difference the way dealers are trained to frame it, as a manageable monthly gap rather than a total number. Because $620 a month sounds like a latte habit and $44,000 over 5 years sounds like a mistake. Marcus never ran that second number. He told me, with a kind of rueful honesty I found refreshing, that he specifically avoided doing the math because some part of him suspected it would talk him out of a decision he'd already emotionally committed to. This is a more common experience than people admit, he said. You don't skip the math because you're bad at math. You skip it because you already know, somewhere underneath the excitement, what the math is going to tell you. And you'd rather not hear it out loud before you've had a chance to enjoy the decision. I want to spend a moment on Ted, the salesman, because Marcus insisted he wasn't a villain in this story, and I think that insistence matters. Ted never lied to Marcus about a single number. Every figure Marcus later felt foolish about was disclosed clearly, in writing, before he signed anything. Ted's actual skill, the thing Marcus came to respect and resent in roughly equal measure, was simply understanding exactly which number a nervous, newly promoted 29-year-old would fixate on, and making sure that number, the monthly payment, was the only one that ever got discussed out loud in the room. Marcus told me he doesn't blame Ted for doing his job well. What he wishes looking back is that he'd walked in with his own number already calculated, the total cost over the life of the lease, so that Ted's version of the conversation would have had nothing to work with. The lesson he draws from it now isn't about car salesmen specifically. It's that almost every environment designed to sell you something has already decided which number it wants you looking at. And the only real defense is deciding, before you walk in, which number you're going to insist on instead. For the first year, the decision genuinely seemed to pay off, at least in the currency Marcus had been optimizing for. Clients responded well to him. His manager mentioned in a performance review that Marcus carried himself like someone ready for the next level, language that felt, to Marcus at the time, like direct validation of the car. He got a modest raise that year and told me he specifically remembers thinking that the car had essentially paid for itself. A piece of reasoning that felt airtight in the moment and that he can now recognize, with distance, as almost completely unfounded. The raise had far more to do with a successful project than with anything parked in the garage. But the timing made it easy to draw a line between them that didn't actually exist. The trouble started slowly, the way it almost always does. The lease renewed at a slightly higher rate in year 3, standard for the industry, but unwelcome all the same. Insurance had crept up alongside it, tied to the vehicle's higher value. A minor accident that wouldn't have been expensive to fix on his old sedan turned into a 4-figure repair because of the cost of parts and labor on the newer model. None of these individually felt like a crisis. Combined, they meant Marcus was now allocating close to $900 a month to a vehicle in a life where his actual income growth had been modest and gradual, rather than the dramatic upward trajectory the car had seemed to promise. By year 4, Marcus had stopped contributing to his retirement account entirely, not through any single decision to stop, but through a slow, quiet deprioritization that happened almost without his noticing. The retirement contribution becoming the one flexible line in a budget increasingly dominated by fixed car-related costs. He told me this is the detail that actually keeps him up at night when he thinks about that period more than the car payments themselves. It wasn't the money spent. It was the money that never got the chance to grow at all during 4 years that, compounding-wise, he can never get back. I asked Marcus about his girlfriend at the time, the one who'd seemed genuinely proud when he signed the lease, because I wanted to understand what that pride was actually responding to. He said, after thinking about it for longer than I expected, that her pride wasn't shallow or materialistic in the way it might sound described briefly. She'd watched him struggle with confidence in the run-up to the promotion, watched him doubt whether he belonged in rooms full of executives, and the car, to her, read as evidence that he'd finally stopped doubting himself. She wasn't celebrating a vehicle. She was celebrating what she thought the vehicle meant about his internal state, which makes the whole arrangement sadder in retrospect, Marcus said, because the internal state it actually reflected was closer to anxiety than confidence. They're not together anymore for reasons that had nothing to do with the car specifically, but Marcus told me that conversation, revisiting what her pride had actually been about, was one of the more uncomfortable parts of finally reckoning with the whole decision. It's easier to blame a slick salesman for a bad financial choice than to admit that the people who love you can sometimes reward exactly the instinct you should have been questioning. The moment that broke the pattern happened almost by accident at a dinner with an old college friend who'd taken a much less impressive-looking path, a modest state job with modest but entirely predictable pay. Over the course of the dinner, the friend mentioned, without any particular emphasis, that he'd just crossed a specific number in his retirement account, a number that startled Marcus into silence because it was larger than anything Marcus had, despite Marcus's higher salary and by every visible measure, more impressive career trajectory. Marcus went home that night and for the first time in 4 years, ran the actual full math on the lease, the total cost across every year he'd had it. Honestly, against what that same money could have done, sitting in an index fund instead. The number that came back was just over $40,000, and Marcus described the feeling of seeing it written down finally as less like anger and more like a kind of grief for 4 years of compounding that had gone somewhere else entirely. He let the lease end and bought a 3-year-old sedan in cash, using savings he'd rebuilt specifically for that purpose over the final year of the lease. The same kind of car, more or less, that he'd been quietly proud of before the promotion ever complicated things. He told me the strangest part of the transition wasn't the financial adjustment, which was straightforward, but the social one. A couple of colleagues asked, half joking, if everything was okay, as though downgrading a car could only be explained by some kind of personal crisis, rather than a deliberate decision. Marcus found that reaction telling. It confirmed, more clearly than anything else could have, that the original lease had never really been about the car at all. It had been about a story he was telling other people and himself, and the story had turned out to be extremely expensive to keep running. If you've ever made a decision because you were sure it was what successful people did, only to find out later, tell me about it in the comments and start with the word lease. So I know you made it to the end. Because Marcus told me one more number, what that same $40,000 would be worth today if he'd invested it instead of leasing with it. And it's a bigger gap than even he expected. That number is next